Welcome to Mixie Veteran Stories, where every story honors courage, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of those history tried to forget. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of real humanity in action. Today's story begins with a blood trail in the dust and ends with 50 Apache warriors riding into a ranch not for war, but to honor a man who gave a dying enemy water. What happened in between will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Old West. Elias McCord had seen his fair share of blood, 12 years in uniform, 3 of them on the front lines of war, left him with more scars than memories. He'd patched up boys no older than 16 and buried men he barely knew. But the blood he found that afternoon trickling down the sandy trail toward his well chilled him in a way combat never had. It wasn't the volume that bothered him, it was the color. Fresh, bright, not the deep rust red of old wounds or the slick black of butchered cattle. This was human and recent. The New Mexico sun was high, baking the land into a crust of dust and silence. His boots crunched over gravel as he followed the trail, rifle slung low but ready. A part of him, the part the war never quite let go, expected ambush, expected pain, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found. Slumped against the old stone well was a young native warrior, barely more than a boy, one hand pressed desperately against a ragged bullet wound in his side, the other reaching upward toward the wooden bucket that hung just out of reach. Blood soaked the earth beneath him, mingling with the dry sand like paint on cracked canvas. His chest rose and fell in sharp, labored bursts. His face was gaunt, lips cracked, and his eyes, though glassy with pain, locked onto Elias with the hardened awareness of a man who had seen too much and expected no kindness from the world. The rifle felt heavier in Elias's hands than it ever had in the war. This was 1847. Out here on the ragged edges of so-called civilization, finding an Indian on your property usually meant one thing: trouble. The kind that arrived in fire, arrows, and screams in the night. His neighbors wouldn't ask questions. They'd pull the trigger first and dig a hole later. And Elias understood why. The blood spilled on both sides of the frontier had soaked deep into the roots of every tree and fence post. The Apache, the Comanche, the settlers, they all carried ghosts. But Elias, he wasn't like his neighbors. Not anymore. He looked into the young man's eyes and saw not threat, but thirst, desperation. The same kind he'd once felt himself after getting separated from his unit in the summer heat of 1838. 3 days with no water. One more and he might have died. He still remembered the first sip that saved him, how it tasted like forgiveness. The young warrior tried to speak, but the only word that escaped was barely a whisper. Water. Elias hesitated for a single heartbeat longer. Then he slung the rifle behind him, stepped forward, and reached for the bucket. It wasn't bravery, it was decency, the kind that doesn't win medals, but keeps you human. The rope creaked as he lowered the bucket into the dark, cool belly of the earth. When it rose again, water sloshing over the sides, Elias knelt and pressed the rim gently to the young man's lips. The warrior drank like a man being pulled back from the edge of death. 3 full buckets before his trembling hands could finally steady the 4th. Elias said nothing. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand a name, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. But deep in his gut, he knew the truth. Mercy always has consequences. And this one was riding toward him. Maybe an hour away, maybe less. He just didn't know it yet. The warrior's breathing slowed as the water settled in his belly. Color began to return to his cheeks, but his hands still trembled. Not from thirst now, but from blood loss. Elias scanned the wound again, more closely. This time, it wasn't a clean shot. The entry wound was just beneath the ribs, scorched at the edges from black powder. Close range. No exit. The bullet was still inside. Worse yet, the bleeding hadn't stopped. Elias pressed a hand gently to the youth's shoulder. "You're gonna need more than water, son." The warrior blinked at him, and for a moment Elias thought the boy might lose consciousness. But then, with tremendous effort, he raised one hand and pointed toward the hills in the distance. He made a slow slicing motion across his throat. The meaning couldn't have been clearer. Danger is coming, fast. Elias looked toward the horizon, empty now, but he'd spent enough time in war to trust instincts sharpened by survival. Whoever shot this boy hadn't finished the job. They were hunting him, and the blood trail led straight to Elias's well. He cursed softly, then stood and looked around the yard. Dust blew through the open gate. Chickens clucked in the coop like nothing had changed. But Elias's heart hammered against his ribs like a fist. He knew the signs: tension in the air, the silence of birds, the way even wind held its breath when death was on the way. He grabbed the water bucket and rushed to splash the trail leading back to the barn. It was too late to erase it fully, but maybe he could blur the worst of it. A sound stopped him cold. Hoofbeats, distant but getting louder. Multiple horses, riding hard. No cattle herder gallops like that. No one does unless they're chasing something. Or someone. He ran back to the well. The boy, Nakai, as Elias would learn later, was trying to sit up, one hand gripping the stone wall, the other over his side. Blood seeped through his fingers again, and his breathing was ragged. "You'll bleed out if you move," Elias growled, gripping his shoulder. "Don't be a hero. Not today." Nakai looked at him with something Elias hadn't expected to see in those dark, pain-struck eyes. Gratitude. And something else. Trust. It hit Elias harder than any bullet. He turned toward the back of the barn, the old root cellar, barely used anymore, but cool, dark, hidden under a trap door behind a pile of tools. It could buy them time. Maybe just enough. But as he reached down to lift Nakai to his feet, the boy gripped his wrist and shook his head. Then he smiled. Not weakly, not with relief, but with knowing, like he already understood exactly who was coming. That's when Elias saw the dust cloud cresting the ridge. 6 riders, moving fast, kicking up dirt like a storm. The glint of rifles. The straight posture of men trained for pursuit. Leading the pack was a man Elias hadn't seen in over a decade but had never once forgotten. Marshal Riker Sloan. Elias's stomach dropped. Back in the war, Sloan had been a captain, a brutal one, the kind who issued orders with a smirk and carried trophies of the men he killed. After the war, he traded his uniform for a badge, but the violence never left him. Rumors said he took bounties no one else would, that he'd made a career out of hunting men who couldn't defend themselves. And now he was coming straight for Elias's ranch. Elias stood in front of the well, rifle slung across his back, trying to look like nothing more than a rancher annoyed by unexpected visitors. The hoofbeats slowed. Sloan's voice rang out, lazy and smooth. "Afternoon, McCord." "Marshal," Elias replied flatly, "we're tracking a wounded Apache. Blood trail led straight to your yard. You seen anything unusual?" Elias felt the sweat trickle down his spine. "Nope," he lied. "Been fixing the fence line all day." Sloan dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. His eyes were like ice. Not cold, just empty. He stepped closer, paused by the well, then knelt down, touching the faint stain Elias hadn't managed to wash away. "Funny place to be bleeding cattle," he said. Elias didn't answer. Sloan stood up, brushed off his coat, and took one step too close. "You wouldn't be hiding anything from me, would you, soldier?" That last word wasn't a title. It was a threat. And Elias McCord knew in that moment the war he thought he had left behind had finally caught up to him. Elias McCord had faced rifles before, flintlocks and percussion caps, ambushes in the bush, point-blank standoffs in smoky tents. But none of them made his skin crawl the way Marshal Riker Sloan's pale blue eyes did as they swept across the dirt yard. Sloan's boots crunched closer. His gloved hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol. Behind him, 5 deputies fanned out, eyes sharp, weapons ready. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to finish a job. "You sure you haven't seen anything, McCord?" Sloan said, circling slightly, the way a coyote circles a wounded calf. "Because I gotta say, the trail of blood says otherwise." Elias stayed still. "No Apache here, Marshal. Just my chickens and an old man who doesn't appreciate being accused of harboring fugitives." Sloan smirked. "You and I both know you're not just some old man, Elias. Last I checked, McCord was a decorated veteran. Served under Major Kellum at Rio Brazos. The kind of soldier who knew when to follow orders and when to break them." That last part hung in the air like the cock of a hammer. Elias didn't reply. He felt Nakai's breath behind him, hidden low by the stone well. Too shallow, too fast. The boy was trying not to cough, not to bleed louder, but Sloan noticed the faint tension in Elias's shoulders. And that was all he needed. He stepped forward again. You know the penalty for aiding an Indian fugitive, don't you? Treason. That's a rope around the neck, soldier. One for you, one for him. Elias's voice came low, steady. Then maybe you ought to check my barn, Marshal, or my root cellar, or maybe the chimney. If I'm hiding someone, I'm sure he'd love to make your acquaintance. It was a gamble. Call the man's bluff or risk the whole ranch going up in gunfire. But then something unexpected happened. Nakai moved, not to flee, not to attack. He spoke. His voice was rough from pain, but the words were crisp. A language Elias didn't understand, melodic and sharp like wind on stone. The effect was immediate. Sloan froze mid-step. His smirk dropped. The other deputies turned toward the voice behind the well, eyes narrowing, unsure whether they should reach for weapons or simply run. Nakai kept speaking, louder now, though sweat poured down his face and he clutched his ribs with one blood-stained hand. When he stopped, the silence was thunderous. Elias turned, stunned. What? What did you just say? Sloan answered before Nakai could. His voice was dry, brittle, like the wind through bones. He said his name. Elias watched the blood drain from the marshal's face. He said his name is Nakai Tashunka. The name meant nothing to Elias until Sloan added, son of Chief Tashunka, the Apache negotiator behind the Fort Brenner peace treaty. Elias's heart skipped. He looked down at Nakai, the boy gasping for breath beside his well, and saw not just a wounded stranger, but the linchpin of peace in the entire Southern Territory. The treaty had ended a 3-year campaign of midnight raids, torch-lit revenge, settlers murdered in their sleep. Elias had seen what the war had done to both sides. He'd even lost a friend, a fellow soldier, in the Salt Creek Massacre, and this boy had helped stop all that. But now Sloan's pistol was already half drawn. He's wanted for murder, the marshal growled. Shot Colonel Morrison 2 nights ago in cold blood. Left him dead in the canyon outside Bernalillo. Nakai coughed, spoke again. Elias turned. What's he saying? But Nakai switched to English. I didn't kill Morrison, he gasped. I met him to discuss expanding the treaty. He'd discovered traitors. Men selling weapons to renegade tribes to keep the war going. Men who profit off blood. Sloan snapped. Lies. He gave me a letter, Nakai continued, trembling, written by his own hand. Names, dates, proof. Elias's mind reeled. If Nakai was telling the truth, it wasn't just Sloan who was dirty. It was a network of smugglers, officials, maybe even military officers. The kind of corruption that could shatter everything the treaty had built. You expect us to believe that? Sloan hissed. From a dying savage? Nakai's hand reached into the pouch tied to his belt. For a moment, everyone flinched. Then he withdrew a folded, blood-stained paper. Elias took it carefully and opened it. Inside, scrawled handwriting, barely legible, but clear enough. Colonel Morrison's seal, his signature, a list of names, and at the bottom, one line that made Elias's blood run cold. If I don't return by sunrise, assume I was betrayed. Elias looked up, meeting Sloan's eyes. You knew. Sloan didn't blink. I knew what had to be done. You were there. I was sent to clean up the mess. Morrison made the mistake of trusting an Indian. And now we've got a martyr instead of a war hero. That was it, the admission. Even his deputies heard it. Elias could see it in their faces, one by one, the doubt crawling in, cracking their loyalty open like dry wood. One of them, a young deputy named Granger, stepped forward. Marshal, he said slowly, I thought we were here for justice. We are, Sloan snapped. That's what justice looks like. He pointed to Nakai with his pistol, but Elias stepped in front of the wounded warrior, his stance steady, voice like stone. No, that's what truth looks like. For a second, the ranch held its breath. Dust drifted through the evening air, and on that quiet breeze, far beyond the hills, came the sound of something new. Drums, distant, rhythmic. A message. They were not alone, not for long. The sound started as a low murmur on the wind, barely louder than the rustle of the cottonwoods behind Elias's barn. But it grew. Drums, hoofbeats, dust. And then they saw them cresting the ridge. Not six, not a dozen. Dozens of Apache warriors rode in formation, war paint gleaming in the sun, feathers trailing like flames behind them. They came not with the speed of vengeance, but the purpose of justice. Sloane's face went white. Elias didn't move from in front of Nakai, whose breath was now steadier, but whose blood still soaked into the earth beneath him. His hand clutched Morrison's letter like a final heartbeat. "Dear God," Deputy Granger whispered, "there must be 50 of them." 75, Elias said. "And they're not here to kill. They're here because they were called." Nakai had summoned them, with his voice, with his song. From the saddle of the lead horse dismounted an elderly Apache chief. His face was carved with lines of age and pain, but his bearing was that of a mountain, immovable, regal. His eyes, like polished obsidian, swept the scene without panic. He walked straight to Nakai, father and son. When they embraced, the entire Apache line dismounted in silent unity. Sloane still held his pistol, but it hung awkwardly now. Not raised in authority, but clutched in fear. Elias saw something else. One of Sloane's own deputies quietly stepped back from the marshal and placed a hand over his own holster. Not to draw, but to disarm. The air felt like kindling. Then the chief spoke in perfect English. "Marshal Sloane, I am Tashunka, father of Nakai. I have heard you came to murder my son." Sloane's mouth worked silently. "I came to arrest a suspect," he said at last. "You came to silence a witness," the chief corrected. "A man who holds the last words of a colonel murdered not by my people, but by your allies." Tashunka turned to Elias. "You gave my son water when others would have given him a bullet. You stood between him and death, though your neighbors would call it madness." Wigo. Elias looked at Nakai, then back at the chief. "Because he was dying," Elias said. "Because once a medic gave me water on a battlefield in Louisiana when I thought I'd never see morning again. And because I've seen enough blood spilled over lies." A silence fell over the yard. Then Nakai struggled upright, leaning on Elias's shoulder. His voice was steady. "I have the letter." Morrison named them all. The gunrunners, the officers, the ones who profit from war. He handed the blood-stained paper to the chief. Sloane lunged. "No!" But a dozen Apache rifles were raised before he could even reach the document. Deputy Granger stepped forward, hand on his revolver, this time pointed not at the Apache, but at Sloane. "Stand down, Marshal." "Granger, you don't understand. This will ruin everything." "No," the deputy said coldly. "You ruined everything." Another deputy, the old man named Walker, tossed a small leather satchel into the dirt. "Found it in Sloane's saddlebag," he said. "Letters, lists, bank drafts, all confirming Morrison's accusations." Tashunka knelt beside his son. He placed a weathered hand over Nakai's chest and closed his eyes. Then he looked up and said, "The war you wanted, Marshal, ends here. Not in fire, not in murder, but in truth." Sloane's hand trembled. He looked from face to face, white and Apache alike, and saw no allies left. Only judgment. He raised his pistol. But Elias was faster, not with a gun, with his voice. "Don't," Elias said. "Don't give them one more reason to see us as enemies. You've already lost, Riker, but maybe you can choose how you fall." For a long second, the pistol didn't move. Then Sloane let it fall to the dust. Tashunka nodded once. Justice would come, not from vengeance, but from facts that no court could ignore. And as the warrior stepped back to allow Elias space to breathe, Nakai turned to him one final time. "My people will remember what you did." Elias simply nodded. "Your people deserve to remember you alive." As the sun dipped below the western hills, casting long shadows across the ranch, the dust finally began to settle, both literally and in Elias's heart. Nakai, his wound now bandaged by the tribe's medicine man, stood upright beside his father, the proud tilt of his head returning slowly with each breath. Elias stood a few steps away, hat clutched in his hands, sweat drying on his brow, unsure of what would come next. Tushonka stepped forward. He was no longer just a chief in that moment. He was a father, a judge, and a witness to what few white men had ever done on Apache land. "You gave my son life when you had every reason to give him death," the chief said. "You chose not fear, but mercy, not orders, but honor." Then he did something Elias never expected. He placed both hands firmly on Elias's shoulders. The circle of warriors that surrounded them closed in, not as a threat, but as witnesses. The air thickened with ceremony. "He is now brother to our people," Tashunka declared in Apache, then repeated in English. "Let it be known from this day forward, Elias Monroe walks in the light of our ancestors." One by one, the warriors came forward. Each laid a hand on Elias's chest or shoulder, a quiet gesture, not of conquest, but of kinship. Nakai approached last, placing a long war lance in Elias's hands. It was adorned with eagle feathers, turquoise beads, and patterns older than most nations. "This belonged to my grandfather," Nakai said. "No one outside our bloodline has ever held it, until now." Elias felt the weight of the wood and of the honor in his calloused hands. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "I just gave a dying man water," he said finally, voice hoarse with humility. Nakai smiled. "Sometimes that's how the world changes." Behind them, Sloan and Hawkins were bound and placed on horseback under close watch. They would stand trial not in the saloons of biased towns, but under federal scrutiny. Their corruption already exposed by Morrison's letter and the satchel of damning evidence. Deputy Granger approached Elias, eyes heavy but clear. "You know," he said, "this place will never be the same. You might have just ended the war, with a bucket of water and a conscience." "I didn't end anything," Elias said. "I just remembered I was a soldier once, and soldiers don't let men die thirsty, not even former enemies." The Apache began to ride out. Nakai gave Elias a final nod before disappearing over the ridge with his father. And like that, they were gone. But what they left behind could not be measured in hoofprints or footprints. They left behind proof that in a world soaked with blood and suspicion, one man's simple act of compassion could echo farther than any bullet.